There was a saying in Maris that no man truly belonged to the Black Coast until he had learned to sleep through three things: goals, bells, and lies. Goals were everywhere and impossible to silence. Bells rang for prayer, warning, docking ships, tax announcements, funerals, and occasionally for reasons no one could explain clearly afterward. Lies required no explanation at all. They were simply the common speech of the coast, spoken by merchants, harbor officials, fishermen, soldiers, priests, and anyone else who hoped to live comfortably longer than a week. Tomas Veyn had not been born on the Black Coast, though he had spent enough years riding its roads that strangers often mistook him for a local. He had learned not to correct them. Men believed different things about locals. Stable masters charged them less. Gate guards questioned them less. Thieves sometimes hesitated before cutting their purse strings. These were small advantages, but Tomas had built much of his life on small advantages. He was 31, narrow-faced, practical, and entirely lacking the qualities poets admired in men. No one had ever mistaken him for heroic, and Tomas considered that evidence of sound judgment on all sides. His work for the empire had taken him through enough unpleasant country to teach him useful lessons. He had carried tax ledgers through villages that hated taxation, legal decrees to magistrates too drunk to read them, pardons that arrived after executions, and once a sealed jar that emitted faint singing whenever storms approached. Experiences like these gave a man perspective. Specifically, the perspective that danger was not fair, not logical, and very rarely dramatic in the way storytellers preferred. A soldier might survive a skirmish and drown crossing a stream the next morning. Tomas trusted routine more than courage and common sense more than destiny. That morning, unfortunately, common sense was already beginning to lose. Marist was one of the few places on the Black Coast where a man could be thoroughly miserable without feeling particularly endangered. No one unfamiliar with the city would have described it warmly. Its harbor smelled perpetually of tar, fish blood, bilge water, wet rope, horse dung, and boiled vegetables. Its streets became rivers of mud after rain, and its buildings leaned toward one another in ways that suggested either poor construction or unhealthy intimacy. Yet Marist had walls. That mattered. A wall did not guarantee safety, but it improved the odds. Inside Marist, danger usually remained understandable. A man could be cheated, robbed, stabbed, falsely accused, or overcharged, but at least he would generally know why. Outside Marist, explanations became less dependable. Tomas was halfway through a breakfast of stale bread, hard cheese, and wine insultingly diluted with water when the Empire found him. The customs tavern was already noisy with dockworkers and traders arguing over shipments, as though volume might improve mathematics. Tomas had returned from Lasker's ford only the previous afternoon and had promised himself at least 2 days without a saddle. That promise lasted until an imperial clerk appeared. Courier Veyn. Tomas looked up. If this is debt collection, he died 2 weeks ago. The clerk ignored him. Immediate assignment. Tomas leaned back. I returned yesterday. That has been recorded. Then someone should have continued recording until tomorrow. The clerk placed the tube on the table. Tomas broke the seal. Watcher's Gate. He read it twice, hoping the destination might improve. It did not. Who signed this? The governor's office. Confirmed by the Ash Synod. That made it worse. The governor and the synod agreeing usually means someone else suffers. The clerk remained unmoved. Tomas sighed, finished the weak wine in one resigned swallow, and stood. The Empire had a gift for finding men just after they had begun feeling comfortable. The stable yard provided the morning's second disappointment. Brother Caldus stood beside a mule and a narrow iron-banded chest, waiting with the quiet patience of a man who believed official paperwork gave him the right to inconvenience strangers. At first glance, he looked harmless. Too thin for military work. Too carefully groomed for ordinary frontier travel. Too pale for a man who spent meaningful time outdoors. A scholar, then. Or worse, a priest who read like a scholar. Courier Veyn, Caldus said, inclining his head politely. Tomas stopped walking. No. The priest blinked. I beg your pardon? No priests. I am traveling under official authority. That sentence has never improved my day. The stablemaster nearby abruptly discovered a deep interest in harness straps. Tomas crouched beside the chest. It was smaller than he expected, but when he tested its weight, it barely moved. That immediately made it more concerning. What's inside? Synod records. That sounds heavier than records. They are important. Important enough to require armed escort? Yes. Important enough to explain? No. Tomas stood and dusted his hands. Then I assume they are exactly the sort of records likely to get us murdered. Brother Caldus said nothing. That silence was answer enough. What Tomas disliked most was not secrecy itself. Secrecy was ordinary. Governments and churches survived on carefully rationed ignorance. What bothered him was the priest's expression. Caldus was not hiding ordinary bureaucracy. He was afraid. Not of Tomas. Not even of the journey. Of something waiting at the journey's end. That was different. And significantly less encouraging. The southern road left Marist gradually. Stone paving became packed earth. Warehouses became sheds. Sheds became isolated fence plots where stubborn families attempted agriculture in soil that clearly resented the effort. The harbor noises faded behind them. Ahead lay marshland. Flat, wet country where reeds moved in winds that seemed to arrive from nowhere, and pools of black water reflected the sky with unsettling accuracy. They had not been traveling long when an old man hailed them from the roadside. He sat on a broken milestone sharpening a knife with the patient rhythm of someone with nowhere urgent to be. One eye had gone white years ago. His beard was the color of old rope. His hands looked as though they had been assembled from driftwood. "Watcher's Gate?" he asked. Tomas slowed. "Possibly. Bad road this week. Bandits?" The old man spat into the mud. "Bandits steal. Fair point. What happened?" The old man continued sharpening. "3 gone. Travelers." A nod. "How?" The old man paused, then said, "Lanterns." Tomas frowned. "That is not helpful. It's what I've got." At that moment Tomas glanced at Brother Caldus and noticed the priest had gone noticeably pale. That interested him more than the old man's superstition. Because superstition was common. Recognition was not. "You know something," Tomas said. Caldus looked toward the marsh rather than answering. The old man rose with visible stiffness, tucked the knife into his belt, and passed them without hurry. As he did, he spoke in the same tone a man might use when advising someone to avoid thin ice. "If you hear bells in the fog, stay on the road." Then he continued walking. No performance. No theatrics. Just practical warning. Which made it much harder to dismiss. For the first hour after leaving Marist, the road remained respectable enough to justify the Empire's original investment. The paving stones were old but largely intact, laid in the years when imperial engineers still believed roads could impose order on wilderness simply by existing. Grass pushed through the cracks in places, and the shoulders had softened into mud where wagons cut too close, but the rut was still plainly visible. That, Tomas knew, would not last. The Black Coast had a talent for reclaiming anything neglected. Brother Caldus rode in silence for most of the morning, which suited Tomas well enough. Priests generally fell into 2 categories on long journeys, those who spoke constantly and those who waited until silence became uncomfortable before saying something profoundly unhelpful. Caldus, at least for the moment, belonged to neither. Tomas found himself studying the man anyway. The priest sat stiffly, not from poor riding but from anticipation. He kept glancing toward the marsh whenever the road bent southward, as though measuring distance against some private anxiety. Whatever was in the chest concerned him less than where it was going. That was becoming increasingly obvious. The land changed slowly around them. The last signs of Marist's influence faded behind them until even the scattered farm plots disappeared. Reeds grew thicker. Pools of standing water appeared closer to the roadside. The air lost the salt sharpness of the harbor and took on the stagnant smell of wet earth and old vegetation. Twice they passed roadside shrines. One had collapsed entirely, its carved saint face down in the mud. The other still stood, though someone had driven iron nails through the painted eyes. Tomas noticed Caldus making a quiet sign against evil at that one. He said nothing. A man learned many things as a courier, and one of them was that questions often produced answers one would rather not hear. It was nearly midday when they found the wagons. The first sign was the horse. Not alive. It lay half in the ditch, swollen already, one harness strap still attached and the rest torn free. No obvious wound presented itself, though the condition of the body made certainty difficult. Tomas dismounted at once. The wagons stood farther ahead. 3 of them pulled unevenly across the road as though the drivers had attempted to turn them in haste. One wheel had shattered. A crate lay broken open nearby, spilling preserved fish into the mud where flies had already claimed them. Nothing about the scene suggested bandit work. Bandits were practical men. Bandits stole. These wagons had been abandoned with cargo intact. Tomas moved cautiously between them, hand resting near the knife at his belt. No bodies. No blood. No discarded weapons. No sign of struggle beyond the hurried positioning of the wagons themselves. Brother Caldus remained mounted. Do you know what happened here? If I did, Tomas said, I would be considerably less annoyed. One wagon still contained folded blankets, a cooking pot, and a child's wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse. Travelers, then. Families, perhaps. That was worse. He crouched near the mud and found tracks, but the wet ground had blurred them badly. Too many footprints. Too much water. No useful direction. Then he noticed something that made him pause. A lantern hanging from the rear wagon. Still full of oil. And used. Tomas stood slowly. The old dockworker's warning returned to him with unwelcome clarity. He turned toward Brother Caldus. The priest had gone pale again. You have exactly one opportunity, Tomas said, to explain why every mention of lanterns seems to affect you like bad prophecy. Caldus swallowed. But before he could answer, another voice spoke behind them. Because if frightened men abandon food and transport, they were not fleeing thieves. The voice came from the roadside. Tomas turned sharply. The rider had approached so quietly that neither man had heard him. He sat astride a dark horse whose age was difficult to guess beneath weather and scar tissue. Horse and rider looked equally worn, though both gave the impression of dangerous competence. The man himself wore practical armor rather than ceremonial plate, patched in places, well-maintained in others. A long scar crossed from temple to jaw, vanishing into his beard. Nothing about him looked recent. Nor did anything about him look weak. Convenient arrival, Tomas said. Unfortunate timing, the rider replied. Not hostile. Not friendly. Simply factual. Brother Caldus had gone very still. Interesting. The stranger dismounted without haste and inspected the wagons with the efficiency of someone accustomed to ugly scenes. No looting, he said. No bodies, Tomas replied. The man nodded once. Worse. He crouched beside disturbed mud, studied it briefly, then stood again. Families. At least one child. How do you know? The toy. Tomas disliked him immediately for noticing first. And your conclusion? That they left willingly. That makes no sense. Most unpleasant things do. The man turned then, meeting Tomas' gaze directly. Ser Garan Veil. Tomas gave his own name without enthusiasm. Garen's attention shifted briefly to Caldus. Recognition passed between them. Brief. Controlled. Impossible to miss. So the priest knew him too. Excellent. Another secret. Should we be worried? Tomas asked. Garan considered the question longer than necessary. Yes. Then he mounted again. And would apparently have ridden away had Tomas not called after him. That is not particularly useful. Garan looked back. If you see lanterns after dark, stay where you are. Then he rode on. Tomas stared after him. Is everyone on this coast insane? Brother Caldus did not answer. Which, by then, Tomas had begun to understand was answer enough. They reached Pinewood Crossing late in the afternoon. Calling it a village required generosity, but it was inhabited, which on the Black Coast often counted for more. A dozen houses leaned around a muddy central yard where chickens wandered with suicidal confidence. Smoke rose from low chimneys. Someone was repairing fishing nets despite being nowhere near useful water. Children watched their arrival from a safe distance. An old woman on a doorstep stopped speaking when she saw Brother Caldas. That Tomas noticed. Everything was being noticed now. The inn was little more than a timber hall with ambitions, but it offered hot food, dry benches, and a roof that appeared mostly sincere. That was sufficient. Inside, the usual cautious interest greeted strangers. A fisherman missing several teeth watched Tomas too closely. A broad woman ladling stew studied the priest openly. Nobody seemed relaxed. Even the children outside had been unusually quiet. Eventually Tomas caught one boy staring at the chest. What? The child hesitated, then asked, "Are you going south?" Yes. The boy glanced toward the window. Lights came last night. A woman crossed the room immediately and pulled him away before he could elaborate. No stories. It wasn't a story. Quiet. Tomas exchanged a glance with Caldas. The priest focused intently on his meal. That irritated Tomas more than fear would have. Fear was understandable. Silence was deliberate. And deliberate silence usually meant knowledge. They left Pinewood crossing the following morning beneath a sky the color of old iron. Tomas had slept badly, though not for any reason he would have admitted aloud. The inn had been dry enough, the food acceptable, and no mysterious bells had rung in the night. Yet the conversation with the dock worker, the abandoned wagons, the frightened villagers, and Brother Caldas's increasingly suspicious silences had combined into the sort of unease that did not prevent sleep so much as poison it. A man in Tomas's profession learned to distrust patterns. 1 frightened villager meant superstition. 2 suggested rumor. 3 suggested either coincidence or trouble. By the time one encountered a 4th, optimism had usually become expensive. The road narrowed as they continued south, though it remained passable. Pools of standing water gathered close enough to the shoulders that a careless horse might easily break a leg if startled. Brother Caldas remained silent until Tomas finally tired of it. "I am beginning," he said, "to strongly resent how much I know nothing." The priest looked over. "That is a curious sentence. It is an accurate one. I am not withholding information for amusement. That is unfortunate, because amusement would at least be understandable." Caldas sighed. "The matters I am involved in are not entirely mine to disclose." That answer works much better in buildings than it does in marshes. The priest hesitated, then said, "There have been incidents." "That is not information. That is vocabulary. Disappearances. We established that. In more than one settlement." That got Tomas's attention. "How many?" "I do not know precisely." "You are transporting records and do not know?" "I was given sealed materials to deliver." "Which means you know enough to be frightened." Caldas looked ahead again. Tomas waited. Nothing followed. He almost laughed. "Remarkable," he said. "You priests can somehow make honesty more irritating than lying." By late morning the road ceased pretending to be reliable. The marsh had advanced over a low stretch of paving, swallowing stone beneath dark water and reeds. Whatever maintenance crews the Empire once sent this far had long since found easier employment or better graves. Tomas dismounted and tested the flooded section with a branch. Too deep for safe crossing. Too uncertain to risk the wagon route. "There's a detour," he said. Brother Caldas looked at the tree line to the west. "Through the forest? Along the edge?" "That is not reassuring. Most roads here are not." The black pine forest had a reputation, though Tomas placed limited trust in reputations. Every forest in the Empire collected stories eventually. Spirits, witches, banished hunters, strange lights, half-human creatures, ordinary men were remarkably creative whenever trees obstructed visibility. Still, black pine inspired a particular kind of storytelling. The trees stood unusually close together, their trunks dark and straight as pikes, the undergrowth sparse in some places and impenetrable in others. Even in daylight the interior seemed dimmer than it ought to be. As they rode the detour, Tomas noticed crude protective charms tied to branches where the road bent nearest the woods. Twine, bone fragments, bits of rusted metal, bundles of dried herbs. Superstition again. Then he saw the old temple. It appeared only briefly through the trees, little more than broken stone and a leaning arch half consumed by roots. What is that? Brother Caldus followed his gaze. Temple of Varash. Should I know what that means? Probably not. That is becoming your preferred answer. The priest looked away. It was abandoned generations ago. Why? No answer. Naturally. Tomas gave the ruin one final glance before the trees swallowed it. He had no intention of visiting. Which, in his experience, was exactly the sort of thought fate enjoyed mocking. The first arrow missed. Tomas heard it before he understood it, the sudden slicing sound of something moving too quickly past his ear, followed by the impact of wood striking wood behind him. His horse reared violently. Down. This, at least, was familiar. Men burst from the roadside brush. Not bandits. Bandits dressed like desperation. These men moved with discipline. Mixed armor. Old military gear. Weapons maintained properly. Positioning coordinated. Deserters. Tomas hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up behind a fallen log just as another arrow struck where his chest had been. Brother Caldus shouted something unintelligible. One of the attackers advanced too aggressively, sword raised. Tomas caught the blade on his own and nearly lost his grip from the force of it. The man knew how to fight. That was unfortunate. They traded blows in wet mud until Tomas managed to drive his shoulder forward and knock him sideways. Then another attacker entered the fight and abruptly collapsed. A sword had entered through his back. Ser Garan Veil withdrew the blade with efficient indifference. Of course. Another deserter turned toward him and died moments later. Garan moved like a man who had survived enough violence that this no longer qualified as noteworthy. Short. Economical. No wasted effort. Within minutes it was finished. The survivors fled. Or tried to. One made it perhaps 20 paces before Garen's thrown knife corrected the decision. Tomas stood breathing hard. I am developing mixed feelings about your timing. Garan ignored him. One wounded deserter remained alive, bleeding heavily. Tomas knelt beside him. Why attack? The man laughed weakly. Thought. Church silver. He coughed. Then, after a pause. Wasn't us. Wasn't who? The lanterns. Then he died. Tomas remained crouched there a moment longer. He was beginning to dislike that word. The dead were searched. Not out of cruelty. Out of practicality. Deserters rarely carried much worth stealing, but information could be useful. One had old military insignia from Carhold. Another carried spoiled food and a letter never delivered. A third wore boots worth taking, though Tomas left them. Brother Caldus sat against a tree, visibly shaken. His hands would not stop trembling. First ambush? Tomas asked. The priest looked offended. Of course not. Then you handle them badly. Garan inspected the area with the same detached focus he had shown at the wagons. You were followed, he said. By them? Possibly. Comforting. Garan glanced toward the road. No. That single word carried enough certainty to sharpen the air. Tomas straightened. What does that mean? The older man looked at him. It means deserters do not abandon usable horses after winning. Tomas thought of the wagons. The families. The missing travelers. Something cold settled into place in his thoughts. Then what are we dealing with? Garan did not answer immediately. Then, I was hoping to be wrong. Which was not, Tomas reflected, remotely close to an explanation. They reached Thornwatch later than intended. Tomas had expected something closer to a fortified outpost, perhaps a timber palisade and a handful of stubborn men pretending not to be isolated. Thorwatch proved larger than that, though not by enough to inspire confidence. The settlement sat on slightly raised ground where the marsh gave way to firmer earth, enclosed by thick timber walls darkened by weather and patched repeatedly over the years. Smoke drifted upward from within, and narrow watch platforms overlooked the road approaches with the kind of practical ugliness frontier settlements often acquired. It was not an impressive place. It was, however, alive. That alone made it welcome. A pair of guards opened the gate only after an argument long enough to suggest either caution or boredom. Tomas preferred caution. Bored guards tended to invent work. Inside, Thorwatch was crowded in the way defensive places often became. Houses leaned inward to save space. Rain barrels sat beneath nearly every roof edge. Woodpiles were stacked with military precision. Chickens wandered wherever they pleased, apparently immune to hierarchy. The settlement smelled of smoke, damp timber, stew, and too many people living too close together. Civilization. A tired sort of civilization, perhaps, but recognizable. Brother Caldus seemed relieved. Tomas found that interesting. A priest who feared roads more than fortified settlements was understandable. A priest who feared fortified settlements less than marshes was something else. The watch commander was a broad man named Harvin, gray-bearded and permanently irritated, as though the world had inconvenienced him continuously for decades, and he saw no reason that should stop now. No travel after dusk, Harvin said after reviewing their papers. We only need lodging. You'll get it. That sounded almost generous. Harvin ignored this. Stay inside tonight. Bandits? No. Storm? No. Then what? The commander studied Tomas with visible patience depletion. If I thought explaining improved matters, I'd explain. Tomas glanced toward Garran, who had entered shortly behind them. The older man and Harvin exchanged the sort of brief acknowledgement shared by men who had survived overlapping unpleasantness. Interesting again. Everything was becoming interesting. Tomas disliked that. Night in Thorwatch should have been reassuring. The walls were solid enough. The gate barred properly. There were armed men within shouting distance. The inn was warmer than Pinewood Crossing and considerably cleaner. Tomas ate well for the first time since leaving Marist and began, despite himself, to think perhaps the day's discomforts had reached their limit. This was, naturally, optimistic. The bell rang sometime after midnight. One note. Low. Distant. Tomas woke immediately. At first he thought it must be the settlement alarm, but no shouting followed. No running feet. No sudden movement from the inn below. Then the bell rang again. Brother Caldus, in the adjacent bed, was already awake. That alone was revealing. You know that sound. The priest said nothing. Another bell. Farther away this time. Or perhaps closer. It was difficult to tell. Tomas rose, crossed to the shutters, and opened them slightly. Fog had rolled in, dense enough to blur the torchlight along the walls. The street below should have held at least a few watchmen. Instead, it was empty. Then movement. A figure crossing slowly through the mist. Then another. Neither spoke. Neither carried weapons. Both held lanterns. Tomas felt something tighten unpleasantly in his chest. No, Caldus said quietly behind him. The word carried real fear. That was enough. Whatever this was, the priest had known it might happen. At first Tomas thought they might be townsfolk responding to some ordinary alarm. Then he saw their faces. Not blank. Not unconscious. Simply absent. The expression of people physically present and mentally elsewhere. More figures emerged from the fog. A butcher Tomas remembered from earlier. A woman carrying no cloak despite the cold. A boy no older than 12. All moving south. All carrying lanterns. No one spoke. No one acknowledged one another. They walked with the calm inevitability of people following familiar instructions. Tomas turned sharply. What is this? Brother Caldus sat on the bed, visibly pale. Do not go outside. That is not an explanation. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Another figure emerged. This time Tomas recognized him immediately. Captain Harvin. Still in partial armor. Sword at his hip. Lantern in hand. Walking like all the others. Tomas stared. That's impossible. Brother Caldus laughed once. Not from humor. From exhaustion. You keep saying that. Tomas was already pulling on boots. Where are they going? South. I can see that. Then why ask? That finally irritated Tomas enough to overcome caution. He shoved open the door. The innkeeper was already awake downstairs, standing rigidly near the hearth. You've seen this before. The man nodded. How often? Enough. And no one stops them? The innkeeper looked at him as if the question itself were childish. Try. That was not encouraging. Outside, the procession continued. Lantern after lantern disappearing into fog. And for reasons he would later regret, Tomas found himself following. Brother Caldas caught him before he reached the gate. Not physically. Verbally. 3 provinces. Tomas stopped. The priest stood behind him, breath visible in the cold air. What? 3 provinces, Caldas repeated. That's how many reported this before the records reached Marist. For the first time since meeting him, the priest seemed less concerned with secrecy than with inevitability. These are not stories, he continued. Not isolated incidents. Villages along the Black Coast. Inland settlements. Marsh communities. Travelers disappearing from roads. People found drowned. Others never found at all. And your synod's response was paperwork? That chest contains witness accounts. Tomas stared at him. That chest contains stories? It contains patterns. Then explain the pattern. Caldas looked toward the moving lights. We do not understand it. That is a confession, not information. It's the truth. Garan appeared from the fog at the edge of the square. Not surprised. Not hurried. Armed. Of course. He looked at Tomas only briefly. Either follow them now, he said, or stay inside until morning. Which is wiser? Garan adjusted his gloves. Wisdom and survival are not always the same thing. Then he walked after the lanterns. Tomas looked at Caldas. Looked at the procession. Then followed. Because by then ignorance had become less tolerable than fear. The procession moved with a certainty that made ordinary following difficult. No one hurried, yet no one slowed. The townsfolk walked as though distance held no meaning for them, their lanterns swaying gently in the fog while the road disappeared beneath marsh water and broken earth. Tomas had the growing and deeply unpleasant impression that the people ahead were not choosing their pace so much as obeying one. Brother Caldas followed reluctantly. Garan walked several paces ahead of both, saying nothing. The fog thickened the farther south they went. Thornwatch vanished behind them with unsettling speed. One moment Tomas could still make out faint torchlight through the mist. The next there was only darkness, lantern glow, and the wet, sucking sound of boots leaving mud. No one in the procession spoke. That disturbed him more than panic would have. Fear was human. Silence this complete felt arranged. How far? Tomas asked quietly. Garan answered without looking back. Far enough. Your talent for useless answers remains impressive. No response. The marsh changed around them. The road deteriorated until it became little more than memory beneath pooled water. Dead reeds brushed at Tomas's boots. The occasional shape of half-submerged fence posts emerged and vanished like bones. At some point the bell rang again. Closer now. Not ahead. Somewhere to the left. Then silence. Brother Caldas visibly flinched. How long has this been happening? Tomas asked him. The priest hesitated. Months. That answer stopped Tomas. Months. In reported form. And before that? We don't know. Garan finally spoke. Longer. Tomas looked at him sharply. How much longer? The older man stepped over a fallen milestone nearly swallowed by marsh growth. Long enough that old men warned travelers without understanding why. That was not reassuring. Nothing tonight had been reassuring. Then the lanterns ahead began turning, and Tomas saw the outline of stone through the fog. The chapel had once been substantial. Even ruined, that much was obvious. Its walls remained mostly standing, though blackened by age and moisture, and its bell tower leaned at a visible angle as though one determined storm might finally persuade it to surrender. Water surrounded much of the structure, reflecting lantern light in fractured ribbons. Tomas counted more than 30 lights. Perhaps more. The townsfolk entered the grounds without hesitation. No prayer. No hesitation. No recognition. Simply onward. This is where they come? Brother Caldas nodded. His voice, when it came, was thin. This is where they've been found before. Doing what? Standing. That answer proved entirely accurate. Several villagers had already entered the chapel itself and taken positions among broken pews and collapsed masonry. Others remained outside, holding their lanterns motionless in the mist. No one moved unnecessarily. No one spoke. No one seemed aware of the others. It was the stillness that unnerved Tomas most. A battlefield after slaughter was quieter than ordinary life, but not like this. There was always breathing, shifting, muttering, some stubborn reminder that living creatures disliked silence. This felt different, as though the silence itself belonged here. Then Tomas saw the footprints. Wet tracks. Fresh. Leading through the broken chapel floor toward a stairwell descending into darkness below. He turned to Caldus. "There's something beneath us." "Yes. You knew." "We suspected." That word finally exhausted Tomas's patience. Suspected? Before Caldus could answer, a sound rose from below. Not loud. Not immediate. Just enough to notice. A voice. Then another. Low, distant, impossible to distinguish as words. Singing. Tomas felt cold in a way the night air had nothing to do with. One of the villagers moved. Not abruptly. Slowly. A woman carrying a lantern stepped toward the stairwell. Then another. Then Captain Harvin. "No," Garin said. The single word carried more force than shouting. He moved faster than Tomas would have thought possible for a man his age, catching the woman by the arm. Her reaction was immediate. Not confusion. Violence. She twisted with startling force, striking at Garan with enough strength to stagger him. Captain Harvin lunged a moment later. Tomas instinctively moved to help and was nearly knocked from his feet. Harvin was not behaving like a sleepwalker. He fought like a man fully committed to killing whoever obstructed him. What in God's name? The singing below grew louder. Still indistinct. Still impossible to identify. Then something moved in the darkness beneath the stairs. Not clearly enough to define. A shape. A suggestion. Movement where no movement should have been. Brother Caldus made a strangled sound. One of the villagers screamed for the first time all night, then vanished. Not dramatically. Simply gone. One moment visible at the stairwell edge. The next not. Dragged? Fell? Pulled? Tomas could not tell. Garan did not hesitate. Out. That was all he said. But something in his tone made obedience feel less like choice. They retreated hard and fast. Behind them, several lanterns extinguished at once. Darkness rushed inward. And still the singing continued. Morning made everything less believable. That was perhaps its cruelest quality. By dawn, the fog had thinned. The marsh looked merely miserable rather than haunted. The chapel stood exactly where it had stood hours earlier, broken and damp and entirely ordinary in appearance. No villagers remained. No bodies. No evidence of struggle beyond disturbed mud and Tomas's own certainty that something had happened. Captain Harvin returned to Thornwatch shortly after sunrise with no memory of leaving. The others, Tomas learned, had returned in similar condition. Confused. Exhausted. Entirely unaware. Brother Caldus recovered the chest from where he had abandoned it during the retreat, though his hands shook badly enough that Tomas considered offering help and wisely chose not to. Garan was preparing to leave. Naturally. "You're just going?" Tomas asked. Garan adjusted his saddle straps without urgency. "Yes." "What was that?" "No answer would satisfy you. That is not your decision." Garan mounted. Then, after a pause, said, "If you hear singing twice in one night, do not wait for the lanterns." And rode north. No farewell. No explanation. Typical. Later that morning, as Tomas and Caldus approached Watcher's Gate beneath weak daylight, the guards admitted them without much interest until one of them heard where they had come from. "Thorwatch?" the man asked. "Yes." The guard frowned. "That's odd." "Why?" The man glanced toward his companion. "Messenger came through yesterday. Said the road south was closed." "Closed for what?" The guard hesitated. Then said, "Disappearances." And somehow, after everything that had happened, that simple ordinary answer disturbed Tomas more than the rest.